Every palace shines with gold and marble, but behind those walls, shadows always linger. Kings are remembered, queens are celebrated, yet there was someone else who history never dared to write about. He was not a ruler, not a knight, not even a servant in the usual sense. He was the janitor. The one who swept the corridors, carried away the stains, erased the sins no crown wanted seen. But the more he cleaned, the more he remembered. And what he remembered was enough to destroy empires. Tonight, you will hear the story of the palace janitor, the man who saw too much and was erased from history. Listen carefully, because some say he still walks among the ruins, sweeping not just dust, but memory itself. They say that every palace hides more shadows than chandeliers. The marble halls of kings and queens, polished to a mirror's sheen, are not just witnesses to triumph and beauty, they are witnesses to silence. Two secrets buried so deep that no historian dares to write them down. And within these grand palaces, among the courtiers and guards, among the whispering noblewomen and scheming ministers, there was always another figure, one you would not notice at first glance, one who swept the ashes from the fireplaces, carried away the waste, and scrubbed away the stains no royal hand wanted to see. The palace janitor. It was said that the man had no name, at least no name that survived. His identity was erased so completely that even the servants, those who usually pass rumors from one generation to the next, hesitated when asked. Some called him simply the cleaner, others the shadow of the palace. He did not sit with the other workers. He did not share in their bread. He was a ghost moving between corridors, always there when something unseemly needed to vanish. The story begins in a palace that historians today prefer to leave unnamed. Records exist of its location, yet official books describe only its festivals and battles, never the details of its nights. This palace had many rulers, each more decadent than the last.
Ow.
Yet through all their reigns, one figure remained constant, the janitor. His presence stretched across reigns, decades, perhaps even lifetimes. He seemed ageless. And this was the first whisper. Was he a man at all, or something else entirely? For what other reason would a king keep a nameless man around? A man who served no purpose, asked no questions, took no holidays. Was he a spy? A poisoner? A grave robber? Or was he something older? Something that walked in the night? Something that fed on the sins of the palace, cleaning up the mess when mortals failed to do so? There are more secrets in a kingdom than its open borders will contain. And the deeper a secret is buried, the hungrier it grows. When a king spills blood in a fit of rage, who cleans it up but the shadow of the palace? When a queen poisons her ladies-in-waiting, who buries the bodies but the cleaner? It became a legend, spoken of only in hushed voices. For what is a legend if not the echo of a truth that is too terrible to speak aloud? The legend goes that long ago, a king commissioned a grand palace to be built, a monument to his power and wealth. Within its high walls, countless nobles lived and died. Kings feasted and plotted, queens loved and betrayed. Children laughed and learned, and all the while one man swept the floors. He was an unassuming figure, a simple servant who went about his work in the daily grind of collecting dust and ashes. He was nothing special, or so everyone thought. Yet what does it do to a man to see so much, to sweep not only dust, but sins into the dark? The legend says he began to remember what others wished erased. Every stain left a mark in his mind. Every whisper carved itself into his thoughts. He carried with him not just the weight of trash, but the burden of truth. While others forgot, he could not. And as the years passed, he became something worse than a witness. He became an archive. It is here that the tale grows unsettling. Courtiers began to notice his eyes. They were not the eyes of a servant. They were the eyes of one who had seen too much cold, unblinking, heavy with knowledge. Some said he knew the secret deaths of 3 kings, the forbidden desires of 2 queens, and the true cause of the fire that devoured an entire wing of the palace. He carried in his silence the kind of truths that could unmake dynasties. And so, rumors spread. Whenever a noble disappeared from the record, servants would whisper, "The janitor saw it." Whenever a child born in the palace vanished within days, mothers would mutter, "The janitor carried it away." He became less a man than a superstition, a living embodiment of the past the palace wanted buried. And yet he remained, No one dismissed him. No one dared to remove him. For to remove him was to admit that he existed. And to admit he existed was to admit the horrors he carried. The first attempt to silence him came quietly. A cup of poisoned wine left beside the mop and bucket. He drank it, he collapsed. By morning he was gone. But the following day, when the queen herself entered the corridor, there he was, sweeping the ashes from the hearth, his skin pale, his eyes deeper than before. Servants whispered that death itself had spat him out, unwilling to keep what he had seen. If this was true, then he was no longer a man. He was the palace's conscience made flesh, cursed to remain until every last secret was swept clean. From that moment, whispers about the palace janitor turned into something darker. He was no longer just a servant with uncanny endurance. He became a figure of dread, a reminder that nothing could truly be hidden. The nobles avoided looking at him. Children of the palace were warned never to meet his gaze. He said that if you looked too long into those hollow eyes, you would see the reflection of what you most feared, your own secret, your own sin, replayed in silence, as if he already knew. But the strangest part was not the fear. It was the way history itself began to bend around him. Official records of the palace never once mentioned his existence. Chroniclers wrote of wars and treaties, of marriages and births. Yet not a single word of the one who cleaned the corridors night after night. His presence was erased even as he still walked among them. How can a man be both invisible and undeniable? That paradox alone fed the legend. There are fragments, however, left in private journals of courtiers. One such fragment, hidden in the back of a nobleman's diary, reads, "Tonight I saw him carry something wrapped in cloth. Too small to be a man, too heavy to be a toy. Looked at me and my heart turned to stone. If I live past this year, it will not be by my own virtue, but because he allows me to." The nobleman died 3 months later, officially of illness, but no physician's report survives. The janitor's tasks grew more terrible with time, when a scandal threatened to expose the king's cruelty. It was the janitor who dragged the evidence down to the cellars, never to be seen again. When a priest dared to accuse the queen of blasphemy, his tongue was found nailed to the chapel door. Who cleaned the blood from the floor? The janitor? Always the janitor. His silence was the mortar that held the palace walls together. And yet some say silence is not eternal. Late at night, in the deepest hours when candles burned low, and even the guards dozed, a faint scraping sound could be heard echoing through the halls. The sound of a broom against stone. But what was it sweeping? Dust or memories? The more one listened, the more it seemed like a rhythm, almost like words muttered under breath, as though he were reciting the stories he could not tell aloud, stories only the walls could hear. They say the true measure of a king is how well his servants are treated. Let's just say the royal staff of Eldoria Palace had a different story to tell. There was a legend, a terrifying whisper that slithered through the corridors, a tale of the royal janitor. They say he wasn't just a man, he was an institution. You see, every night after the king's sumptuous feasts, the king would rise from his throne, striding through the great hall with measured steps, not stopping until he reached the door. That door was never opened from the other side. No one dared. So the king was never seen again after he passed through that threshold. It was the staff's duty to clear the hall after the king departed, a task that fell to the head janitor. There is a chilling tale told by one cook who survived long enough to leave her testimony. She claimed that once after a banquet she went into the great hall to retrieve the platters. The feast had ended hours ago, yet she saw him still sweeping. On the floor beside him lay a golden goblet overturned, its rim smeared red. When she looked closer, she realized it was not wine. He raised his eyes to her, and for a moment she swore she heard a voice not from his lips, but from the walls themselves, saying, "You did not see this." She ran that night, abandoning her post, and was never seen at the palace again. And so, the janitor became more than a figure of dread. He became a boundary between what was remembered and what was erased. The palace needed him, yet feared him, for he was not only a servant of kings, but a servant of silence itself. But silence, once fed too much, begins to hunger for release. The more he carried, the heavier the burden grew. The more he erased, the more he became the very thing he erased. His skin began to pale, his frame to wither, but his eyes only sharpened. One account, whispered by a guard, claimed that he followed the janitor down into the lowest vaults one night, curious to see where all the refuse went. What he found was not barrels of trash, nor piles of discarded furniture. He found rows of crates stacked against the damp stone, each marked with a year, each sealed with black wax. And when he pried one open, he saw not rubbish, but relics of the forgotten, a blood-stained veil, a cracked crown, the tiny skeletal hand of an infant. He turned in terror only to see the janitor standing behind him, silent, holding the broom like a blade. The guard vanished from service records the next day. This is the moment the tale begins to blur between myth and memory. Did such vaults exist, or were they figments of fear? The official histories deny them, and yet the silence of denial often screams louder than truth itself. The janitor remained, ageless, indifferent, patient, but those who still whispered about him believed one day he would no longer be content to sweep away the palace's sins. One day the burden would spill over, and when it did, the palace itself would drown in the very filth it had tried to bury. They say the deepest you trace his shadow, the stranger the records become. Historians insist he never existed. Yet here and there, hidden like mold between the stones of history, are scraps of evidence. A burned letter found in a monastery archive, half legible, describes him without naming him. There is one among them who holds the palace's night in his hands. He is not recorded, for he is the record itself. He knows what kings dare not speak. God grant that he never learns to speak it aloud. Another fragment comes from a physician's notes. The doctor had been summoned to tend to the youngest prince after a mysterious illness struck. The child lingered between life and death for weeks, until suddenly, silence. The official record lists fever as the cause. But the physician's private entry is more chilling. The child died not of sickness, he died of fear. He would wake in the night screaming of a pale figure sweeping beside his bed, though no guard ever saw him enter. Treated the body, yet the bruises on the neck could not have come from fever. How could a janitor be present at the bedside of royalty? How could he be there, unseen, when the chamber was guarded? Lest, of course, he was no longer bound by locks and keys, lest the palace itself had opened to him, like a house opening to its own ghost. The silence around him grew so suffocating that even the chroniclers began to betray themselves. In one royal chronicle, written to glorify the king's reign, a strange blank space interrupts the text. Pages have been torn out, clean, deliberate. On the margin, one faint scribble remains. Removed at the request of the cleaner. The hand that wrote it trembled so much the ink bled through. What kind of servant could order a scribe to erase pages of history?
Ow.
And why would the scribes obey? Unless by then, everyone in that palace understood a truth they could never speak. The janitor had become more dangerous than any king. For kings ruled with swords and decrees, but he ruled with silence. He could decide what remained and what was swept away. The most terrifying testimony comes from a letter smuggled out by a maid who fled to another kingdom. She wrote, "The palace breathes him now. We do not see him enter. We do not see him leave. Yet he is always there. Sometimes in the reflection of a goblet, sometimes in the shadow under the table. We hear the brush scrape, scrape, scrape. The others pretend not to hear, but I cannot. The halls are not halls anymore. They are graves where the living walk. He does not clean for the royals. He cleans for the palace itself, as if feeding it. And each night the palace grows hungrier." They found the maid's body weeks later, washed up on the riverbank. The letter was discovered in her shoe, the ink blurred by water, but still legible. She wrote of a plot to kill the king, a conspiracy led by the very man who would inherit the throne after him. But before the young prince could take his rightful place, she said he would have to silence her. That was how they knew she died for the truth. The officials claimed she drowned. Others whispered she had been silenced, her final testimony sealed by the very man she described. As time passed, the palace changed rulers again and again, but the janitor did not change. Faces grew old, crowns passed from head to head. Yet he remained the same pale figure, eyes hollow, movements tireless. The younger courtiers began to whisper a new belief. that he was not simply cleaning away filth. He was collecting it, gathering it, piece by piece, as though assembling a hidden history beneath the official one. One night, when fire consumed part of the eastern wing, servants swore they saw him walking through the smoke unharmed, carrying not buckets of water, but small objects wrapped in cloth, each one dripping with blood. No one dared to ask what they were. By morning, the ashes were cold, the wing destroyed. Yet when the rubble was cleared, the vault below remained untouched. Some said it was already filled to the ceiling with relics no fire could consume. It is here the story turns unbearable. For the palace itself began to wither. Walls cracked without cause. Tapestries rotted within months. Guests spoke of a stench that clung to the halls no matter how much incense was burned. And always the scrape of the broom continued. Some said it was no longer a broom at all, but bone, sharpened and bound in twine, dragging across the stones. Every record ends the same way: silence. At some point, the palace ceased to be mentioned in royal archives. It's not destroyed in war, not abandoned by decree, just erased, as if the kingdom itself agreed to forget. But ruins do not lie. The site exists, though no guidebook marks it. Stones still stand twisted and blackened. And if you walk too deep into the corridors, travelers say you can hear it still. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The janitor still cleaning, perhaps the most disturbing thought of all. If he erased an entire palace from memory, what else has he erased? What chapters of history we think we know were swept away by his silent hand? How many kings, queens, or entire bloodlines vanished, not by conquest, but by cleaning? This is the terror of his tale, not that he lived, but that he may still live. There is a reason the story of the palace janitor never appears in official histories. To write of him was to give him permanence, and permanence was the very thing the palace feared. And yet whispers persisted, carried in secret letters. In the margins of forgotten books, in the tales servants dared to tell only when they were far from home. The picture that emerges is not of a man who vanished, but of one who endured beyond his time. Some believe that when the final dynasty collapsed, the palace was sealed from within. The nobles fled, the soldiers deserted, yet the janitor remained. The last servant to leave claimed he saw him at the gates, broom in hand, sweeping as though the chaos of fire and rebellion were nothing more than dust on the stones. He never raised his voice, never lifted a weapon. But the rebels who stormed the palace swore they felt watched by something older than any throne. They burned the halls, but none dared to enter the lowest vaults. Even in their fury, they feared what lay beneath. Centuries later, travelers still speak of ruins where no birds sing, walls blackened not by fire, but by something deeper, as though the stones themselves refused to hold light. Those who wander too far inside return pale, shaken, their ears filled with a phantom sound. Not the cry of owls, not the rush of wind, but a rhythm: scrape, scrape, scrape. The unmistakable drag of a broom across stone. Archaeologists who once attempted to excavate the site reported strange findings. No tools, no utensils, no signs of ordinary life. Instead, sealed boxes buried beneath the rubble. The records of these discoveries are scarce, almost deliberately so. But one journal survives. It belongs to a young scholar who vanished during the expedition. His final entry is fragmented, written in a hand unsteady and smudged with what might have been ash. We opened the first crate. Inside was no treasure, no relic, only cloth wrapped tight. When it unraveled, I saw a crown still wet, though centuries had passed. How can blood stay wet? And then I heard it behind me, in the dark corridor, the sound of sweeping. Slow, patient, as if he had been waiting for me. I cannot write more. The sentence ends abruptly. Scholar was never seen again. Even today, the ruins remain avoided. Local villagers warn strangers not to linger near sunset. They say that when the last light fades, shadows gather too quickly inside the walls, forming shapes that are not your own. And if you stay too long, you may see him pale, hollow-eyed, dragging his broom. But he does not sweep across dust, only across memory itself. Those who claim to have seen him speak of an overwhelming sense of erasure, as though their very presence was being cleaned away. One traveler, shaken beyond reason, confessed he could no longer remember his own name after standing in those halls. And perhaps this is the final truth. The janitor was never just a man. He was the embodiment of forgetting, the force that sweeps away what should not remain. Kings needed him, queens relied on him, but in the end, he belonged to no one. He belonged to silence. He belonged to history's blind spots. He belonged to the void between what is remembered and what is lost. Think about it. How many times have you read history and felt something missing, as though entire chapters had been quietly removed? How many rulers are named, yet their children vanish from record? How many palaces are described in detail, but their final days are left blank? Perhaps those absences are not accidents. Perhaps they are the janitor's work, his silent broom sweeping across the pages of history itself. And so the story ends, or rather it does not end. Because if he was truly erased, we would not be speaking of him now. His absence is his presence. His silence is his voice. And somewhere in the cracks of forgotten ruins, or perhaps even in the corners of our own memory, the janitor still moves, sweeping, scraping, sweeping. Listen closely the next time you find yourself alone in an old hall, where dust lingers in the air and footsteps echo too long. If you hear that faint rhythm, scrape, 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 do not turn around. Do not look into the shadows. For to see him is to be seen, and to be seen is to be erased. That is why no one remembers the palace janitor, because he remembers you.